Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Well, folks, this is part 21 of the Wolfman Series, a werewolf reunion in the Arctic. Blood oozed through the wounds on Sasha's shoulder and back and soaked through her clothing. The first aid kit in the car was of no use, with nothing more than a few small bandages and a small roll of gauze. Jack knew Sasha needed medical attention quickly, possibly stitches, although the bite wounds were not very deep. Thankfully, the old wolf had worn her teeth down to mere nubs compared to what a younger wolf would have, but they still tore through the skin and there was a risk of infection. Please don't stop, Jack. We are so close now we can't risk getting caught. If we go to the hospital, they'll want identification and ask too many questions. We don't know if they've connected us to your sister's disappearance yet, but we can't take that chance. Please, just drive on to Murmansk. Then we'll cross the border and I can see a doctor in Finland. It'll be safer. But Sasha, we don't know how bad those wounds are. And if they get infected, he let his words drop into silence. I don't want to lose you. Sasha smiled at him and, you won't lose me, Jack. I'm strong. I'll be fine. Though it was all still very early afternoon, the absence of light that enveloped the polar region made it look like it was twilight. In the darkness of the car, Jack could see the blood seeping through Sasha's coat. He knew she was right. Going to a hospital was a risk they couldn't afford to take, but he was worried about her blood loss. Okay, next town we get to, we stop at a market and buy bandages and disinfectant. I'll wrap the wound. But if you feel sick or if you lose consciousness, then damn the risk, I'm taking you in. Sasha turned her head towards the window so Jack wouldn't see her tears. Catherine's heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. She decided it was extremely more painful than Rebecca had let on. The initial stirrings of her transformation began as an indescribable energy coursing through her veins. A tingling sensation permeated every inch of her body, and she felt a surge of power that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She felt her bones begin to elongate, her muscles reshape, and fur began sprouting through her pores. Her senses heightened, and there was suddenly an acute clarity to her vision and her hearing. She watched as her fingernails grew into claws, and her body, previously thin and shapely, filled out in a sleek yet muscular form. She turned her head and felt her neck and spine loosen, crack, and reshape themselves into her new body. It was terrifying and exciting at the same time. She let herself drop down onto all fours, tilted her head back, and unloosed an enormous howl that had reverberated against the glass walls of the cabin. She looked at Usko sitting on the bed, and the look on his face showed all the love and adoration a human man can show. He walked to the door and opened it, then removed his clothes and confidently transformed himself with the skill and grace of a lifetime of practice. The two wolves bound through the open door, running into the twilight glow of the long polar night. It was a freedom like she had never experienced before. She sprinted across the snow-covered ground in the shadows of the towering pines and firs. She could barely feel the frigid Arctic air with her coat of wolf fur. The earth beneath her paws felt alive. Usko ran along beside her and romped and wrestled and played in the snow. Rebecca joined them, and the three chased each other through the trees and nipped at each other's heels. After more than an hour of playing in the snow, the three wolves made their way back to the cabin and promptly fell asleep. Miguel asked the airline attendant for another whiskey. On a flight this long, first-class travel was a necessity, and he appreciated the extra legroom. The attractive Swedish attendant had admired his exotic snakeskin cowboy boots, and when he told her the tale of how he had killed the snake and skinned it himself, she had stood there taking in every word. It didn't matter that the story wasn't the least bit true. She brought him another whiskey on the rocks. The flight to Helsinki was 14 hours long with one layover. Miguel did not like being stuck in a seat for that many hours. He had brought along his favorite book, and that helped. It was called God's Middle Finger, Into the Lawless Heart of the Sierra Madre. And he sat back in his seat laughing out loud as he read it. He'd read it before, a few years back, but it was just as good this time around. Miguel had lived in the Sierra Madre Mountains all of his life, and he knew firsthand what a lawless place it was. Home to bandits, drug smugglers, opium farmers, cowboys, rustlers, all kinds of assorted outcasts. Drugs are still the primary source of income, and murder is considered a regular pastime. It might be one of the largest drug-producing areas in the world, but it was home to Miguel, and he loved it. He loved the ruggedness, the adventure, and the recklessness of his life in the wild mountains of Mexico. Richard Grant, the author of Miguel's book, had spent a few years in the Sierra Madre and wrote about it in a humorous yet brutally honest travel journal published back in 2008. Here was 16 years later, and nothing had really changed. Miguel even knew some of the colorful characters that Richard had written about, and that made it even more fun to read. Well, the pretty Swedish airline attendant sat down in the empty seat across from Miguel. She was flirting just a little. She asked Miguel where he was from. He laughed. He began telling her about the story of the outlaw's buried treasure in the Sierra Madre, made famous in the film The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, starring Humphrey Bogart and Tim Holt. He was pretty sure she didn't understand much of what he said, and sure as hell didn't know who Humphrey Bogart was, but she sat there listening and smiling, so he went on with his story. It was one of the earliest Hollywood movies to be shot on location outside the United States, and it was practically shot right in my backyard, he said. Of course, that was back in 1948, so I wasn't born yet, but if you watch that movie, you'll see my ranch. The pretty flight attendant flashed her beautiful smile and asked what was the movie's name again. Well, it was The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. You see, it's about two broke American drifters that are hired as roughnecks to help construct oil derricks for $8 a day. When the project's completed, the boss skips town without paying them. So they meet this old gold miner, and he convinces them they'll strike it rich mining for gold. Well, they do, and all kinds of hell breaks loose. There's gunfights and federales, and the gold just ends up missing. So all kinds of people flock to the mountains looking for that gold. But the funniest thing is that Humphrey Bogart knew only 2 words in Spanish. Dos Equis. So when he was supposed to say his lines in Spanish, he'd just shrug his shoulders and say, Dos Equis. The young airline attendant threw her head back and laughed. Miguel snickered. She doesn't have a clue what I'm saying, he thought to himself, but he kept on talking anyway. Maybe she'd give him her phone number before the flight was over. Helsinki was in Finland. Jack was in Finland. That was all Miguel knew, and he figured the rest of the story would just work itself out one way or another. He couldn't just sit around the ranch watching his sister Juanita and his soon-to-be brother-in-law Julian rambling around the house like a couple of lovesick burros. So he booked a flight to Helsinki. He figured he'd land, he'd get a hotel room somewhere close by, and see if he could find his friend. Of course, Finland is roughly the size of Montana, and the chances of running into Jack and Catherine weren't very likely. But he figured it would be a fun adventure anyway. He tried to call Jack a few times and left messages. There'd been no response yet. How about another whiskey? He asked the flight attendant as she made another pass through the cabin. Sasha was feeling weak and sick to her stomach. She didn't think she had lost much blood, but when she attempted to take her coat off, she noticed that her shoulder and arm were stiff and very painful. You should leave your coat on for now. It's acting like a bandage. It's absorbing any blood that's leaking from your wound. We will stop soon and get some gauze and antiseptic. Jack saw that she was losing all the color in her already pale complexion. I'm okay, she whispered. It hurt to talk, to move, and she felt like she was going to throw up. Do we have any more water in here? Her water bottle was empty, and she had already finished Jack's as well. No, we don't. I'll get water as well. You should eat something, too. Yes, I'm incredibly hungry. Ravenous, actually. Jack looked over at her. Those were words he did not want to hear. He remembered when he first realized he had been bitten by a werewolf. I was back in the States, in the rainforest in Washington, when he was chasing Yeager's son, Hans. He remembered feeling incredibly hungry and sick to his stomach. Were the bites that Sasha received from that old wolf transforming her? Tell me how you're feeling, Sasha. Be honest with me. Don't just say fine. I don't know, Jack. I feel weak, hungry, sick to my stomach. I feel like my insides are burning up. My head hurts, my back hurts, and my shoulder hurts like hell. Is that enough for you? She felt agitated. She was angry with herself for not being more cautious, for not sensing the attack before it happened. She had just been so focused on trying to help Jack. Jack reached over and touched her arm with his hand. I'm sorry, Sasha. I'm just so worried about you. I know. I'm sorry, too. Let's just get this drive over with. I'm getting so tired of being in this car. We're only about an hour away from Murmansk. Let's just get there. We can get a hotel room. I can get out of these blood-drenched clothes, take a hot shower, eat, and I'll be just fine. Jack sighed. He was driving over the speed limit. Didn't want to draw any attention to their car if they happened to pass a police car. The roads were ice-packed, and he didn't feel like it was safe to go any faster. And anyway, they were almost there. He didn't want anything else to delay their arrival. As soon as they hit Murmansk, he would find a market and get the things Sasha needed, and then he would try to phone Catherine. Hopefully she was still there. He was worried that they might be too late and would discover that Catherine had already crossed over the border. Well, as long as she is safe, that's all that matters, he thought to himself. Catherine, meanwhile, had showered. She was now dressed and sitting on the bed, waiting for Usko to get out of the shower. Rebecca had not yet been able to transform back into her human form. Catherine was worried about her. What if the same thing happened to her? She thought back on how it felt to run through the forest on 4 legs, to feel the frigid air in her nostrils, the cold bristling her fur. It had been exhilarating, addicting, really. She thought she could understand why Rebecca might not want to change back into her human form. Usko walked out of the bathroom, towel drying his hair, another towel wrapped around his lower body. Hey, beautiful, he said as he smiled at Catherine. How soon do we have to leave to meet your family, she asked. We've got about an hour. We'll meet them there and walk around Snow Village a bit. I'm anxious for you to see it. Then we'll go get some dinner. How does that sound? Great. So while we're waiting, can I ask you a few questions about what happened, she asked. Sure, go ahead. Well, there's a couple things I really don't understand. It's very confusing. Why is it that some werewolves are more vicious and monster-like, and others are more like large, furry wolves? I always thought werewolves were half man, half wolf, and stood on 2 legs and were ugly as could be. Not the least bit lovable and charming like you are, she laughed. That's a good question. I've spent my lifetime studying the science of the wolf, trying to understand just that. And how could I have changed after I was bitten? The way I understand it is that there are certain chromosomes that make up our DNA and RNA. And some of these dictate whether we are male or female. Some dictate our human or non-human form. The DNA is basically our genetic blueprint, and the RNA gives instructions for the functions of our cells. I won't go into the genetic science of how it all works, but essentially the nucleic acids are the macromolecules that hold the evolutionary memory of all life on Earth. When the coding of these cells is altered by the introduction of the enzymes in the wolf's saliva, it causes the entire genetic code to change. There's an actual physical transformation that occurs, but there is also mental and emotional transformation as well. That could explain why some essentially bad people transform more into the legendary monsters that we're familiar with. And then, of course, Hollywood and fairy tales have a lot to do with how we think werewolves should look. In the early centuries, wolves were much more abundant and food was scarce. They would seek out food sources wherever they could find it. Children were much less protected back then. It was the children who were sent to herd the cows and the sheep, the other livestock through the woods where they might encounter a wolf. And many legends and old fairy tales grow from this. But if you look back over the centuries, the werewolf has shown up in historical legends from as far back as written history goes. Remember when you first knew your brother was a werewolf and how you described Julian? They were fighting to protect you and they appeared very much in their human wolf form. But today, we were running through the snow and having fun, and we were running as wolves. I think the action or the circumstances may also dictate the transformation that we go through. It is also interesting to note that there are other human and animal transformations as well. There are stories of people who can transform into cats, for example. "That's right," Catherine exclaimed. "When we were in Mexico, we met a few people who could transform into jaguars." It's an interesting concept. It makes me wonder about how many of the different cryptids and monsters that are out there. You know, like the dogmen and the Bigfoot and, well, even mermaids and selkies. It all sounds like fairy tales. But maybe these things are real. And maybe it has to do with some genetic code that became altered in some way. Usko agreed. Yeah, even growing up in Mongolia, we knew about Spider-Man and the comic book heroes. It makes you wonder what's real and what's fiction. My ancestor, the great Genghis Khan, was said to be the child of a great blue wolf and a fallow deer, and he was certainly not a fictional character. That's very interesting. But I have another question too, Catherine commented. Why is it that Rebecca is having difficulty changing back into her human form, and Spencer can't seem to change at all? Is that going to happen to me? No, Kat. You don't need to worry about that. Your bloodline is pure. That serum that the professor or doctor or whatever he was made up was not normal. He was trying to play God or mad scientist like a Dr. Frankenstein. You just can't create a mutant. I honestly think Spencer and now Rebecca and anyone else he might have gotten to with that serum are in for a short life. Much the same as a wolf in the wild should have, or a domesticated dog. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Catherine sighed and looked over at the little wolf sleeping curled up in the lounge chair. We need to protect her. I think we should buy her a colorful collar and a leash and make sure people think she's a dog and not a wolf. I agree, Usko said. Catherine's phone was ringing. She jumped up from the bed and pulled it off the dresser. Oh my God, it's Miguel. Jack pulled into the parking lot of the supermarket. Sasha was moaning from the pain. Jack ran inside and grabbed the items he would need. He got some gauze, some antiseptic spray, a gallon of milk, and stopped to throw several packages of lunch meat into the basket. Then quickly ran up to the counter to pay. It was fortunate that the checkout woman knew a little bit of English. Motel? She nodded and pointed down the road. 3 blocks. Back in the car, he drove quickly to the motel and got them a room. He carried Sasha in and laid her down on the bed. She let him remove the soaked coat and clothing, and he gently washed the bite wound with warm water. Then he sprayed the antiseptic on and wrapped it in gauze. It was no longer bleeding, but it was very red and inflamed. We've got to make sure this doesn't get infected, he said. I'll be fine. Just give me something to eat and some water. He opened the packages of lunch meat and he watched as Sasha stuffed them into her mouth as quickly as she could. Phew, I feel better already. I don't know if it was low blood sugar or if I just needed to wolf that down, she grinned at Jack. He smiled at her joke. Do you want me to get you some more food? There's a restaurant just across the street. I can get takeout. Yes, please. and then see if you can reach your sister." "Miguel," Catherine yelled excitedly into the phone. "Where the hell are you? Are you okay?" Miguel responded back. "I'm okay. I'm here with Usko. Have you heard from Jack?" "No, I've been trying to reach him." "Where are you?" he asked. Hold on." She looked over at Usko and held her hand over the phone and whispered, "Is it okay to tell him?" Usko grimaced and said, "Are you sure it's him? Better to ask where he is." "Miguel, I'm sorry, I can't risk telling you at this moment. You know, in case anyone intercepts the call. But I'm okay. Where are you?" "Well, hell, I'm in Helsinki," he laughed. Catherine noticed his words sounded just a tiny bit slurred. The whiskeys had done their work. She laughed and she whispered to Usko, "It's definitely him." "Well, just find a hotel, stay where you are, and wait for me or Jack to call you, okay?" "You bet, mi amiga." Catherine hung up the phone. He's such a character, and he's in Helsinki? "We've got to get going." Usko grabbed her coat and handed it to her. She went over to Rebecca and patted her ears. "You stay, little wolf. We'll be back soon." She didn't notice that she'd left her phone laying on the bed. The motel that Jack and Sasha were in was packed. They were lucky to get the last room available. The restaurant across the street was filled to capacity. Jack stood at the counter and hoped that someone would be able to help him that spoke English. Finally, a young man walked up to the counter and said, "How many?" "Oh, good, you speak English. I would like takeout." The young man handed him a sheet of paper with the menu items written in English. "You are packed," Jack exclaimed. "I'm surprised to see so many people here." "It is Snow Village. Many tourists. You should see." He responded in broken English, and he left to place Jack's order. Back at the room, Sasha was feeling better. Just getting out of the car and being able to walk around seemed to help. When Jack arrived with the food, she was already showered and dressed. "Let's eat, then I want to walk around for a bit. It really seems to relieve the pressure on the bite. I think sitting in that car for so long made it cramp up." "Well, the guy at the restaurant said there was a snow village here nearby. Do you really feel like walking that far?" "Oh, yes," she exclaimed. "I remember going there when I was a little girl. It was beautiful. I'd love to see it again. It's really spectacular, Jack. I think it's just the diversion I need. Did you get a hold of your sister?" "No, damn it. I tried her phone again, but there was no answer. I left another message. The last message I had from her referred to Boston. So I know she got my message letting her know we were on our way. But maybe they've already started to trek across the border. Well, there's nothing you can do but keep trying." They ate the hamburgers and walked the 4 blocks to the snow village. Usko and Catherine were walking arm in arm, careful not to lose each other in the crowd of tourists that flocked to Snow Village in the evening. There was music and street vendors and a party atmosphere. The sculptures were beautiful, intricately carved out of blocks of ice and lit with bright lights. "I want to take you to the snow bar. They serve cocktails in ice glasses. All the bar stools are carved from ice, and even the counter is ice. Hopefully my mom will be there soon." "Sounds good," Catherine replied. They pushed their way through the crowds to the center of the snow village, which encompassed an area about the size of 4 square city blocks. "It should be just up here around the corner if I remember right," Usko said, as he guided Catherine through the maze of ice sculptures. Suddenly she stopped, cold in her tracks, and gasped. Walking towards her was a man holding the arm of a beautiful Russian woman. She burst into tears and ran into his arms. "Jack!" she cried.